VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And thank you for joining us on Crosstalk here on the VCY America Network. My name is Jim Schneider, and ladies and gentlemen, I probably don't have to reveal this to you. You already know it. We are living in a world that's in tumult, a world that's in turmoil, and certainly we are seeing uprisings taking place, and what we're focusing on today is Egypt once again, and specifically Egypt's coming tyranny. It's amazing to see what is taking place in Egypt, and we're going to get right into it today with our special guest, Ted Shoebat, the son of Walid Shoebat, a former P.L.O. terrorist. Ted is a dedicated researcher of his own right on issues like socialism, liberalism, Islamism, and communism. He is the author of In Satan's Footsteps, The Source and Interconnections of All Evil, and a co-author of For God or For Tyranny, When Nations Deny God's Natural Law. Ted, thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
Thanks for having me, sir. Good to be on.
Last week, you wrote a column stating that Egypt now has a modern pharaoh named Mohammed Mursi, and that the nation is headed toward a Sharia state. And before we look at this, though, Ted, at some of these current events going on, let's just go back several months. I thought there was something called this Arab Spring that was going to usher in democracy, where Hosni Mubarak was removed from the picture. Wasn't that the promise that the world was told?
Yes, that's right. And we were told by CNN that it was a moderate revolution, and that the revolution was for liberty and the pursuit of all happiness. And we were also told that Mohammed al-Baradei, the father of the Egyptian revolution, was a moderate, and he was praised by CNN as a liberal individual with liberal Western values. But it's just not the case. In fact, if you look at the article that I wrote, it's called The Coming Sharia State of Egypt on our website, my website, tedshubat.com. The executive member of al-Baradei's party, al-Dastur, his name is Mohammed Yusri Salame. He says that the majority of the Egyptian people want Sharia, and that the only thing or the only entity stopping Sharia or the Islamic code, Islamic law, from being enforced in Egypt is the Muslim Brotherhood. So it is the Muslim Brotherhood that has that power to make Egypt into a Sharia state. This is the moderate group, the moderate group that founded the revolution. They want Sharia. So the problem with today is that we are living in the tyranny of cliches, in which if you use certain terms, it makes any situation sound good.
So
it makes any situation sound good.
Are the people demanding Sharia? Is that true?
Well, of course, majority of Egyptian people want Sharia. Look at the parliamentary votes. You had over 75%, or around actually 75% of the parliament, either members of the Salafi or of the Muslim Brotherhood. Both groups are connected with Al-Qaeda. Both groups are umbrella organizations. And so the Muslim Brotherhood is an umbrella organization. The fact that they voted in a Muslim Brotherhood member, Mohammed Mursi, tells us that the majority of Egyptians want Sharia to be enforced in their country. Osama bin Laden was linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. Osama bin Laden is a product of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we're dealing with a very dangerous country, in my opinion, and the Egyptian people, as far as I'm concerned, have become a mob. They have become a mob, and once Sharia is, in fact, enforced, it will not only be the government who will be doing the enforcing, but the people themselves. They will be a mob. Just like, for example, when France became revolutionary and was ruled by Robespierre, who was beheading all the people in the guillotines in the French Revolution? It was the people. Many of the people rose up, the masses. And there's a saying that I like to give to people when talking about these sorts of things. Tyranny is founded in the masses. It is always founded in the masses. So when we see a dictator like Mohammed Mursi come out, well, who is to blame? Who gave Mursi that power? It was the people. It always comes down to the sentiments of the people. Governments are a mere reflection of the hearts and minds and souls of the people.
Yeah, another
right.
example of that is our recent election here.
Exactly. Exactly. It's a very good point. And so even if Mursi, let's say he wants to become a dictator, and right now he's trying to compromise with the Supreme Judicial Council in Egypt, which is the second branch of government. So they have the executive, which is Mursi, the president, and then you have the judicial branch of government. Well, he wants to compromise, and now he's saying, well, I will give you the appropriate powers that you are to observe, but I simply want to be the sole protector over the drafting of the new Constitution. Mm-hmm. Well, if he becomes the sole protector, that means he dictates how the Constitution will be. And he is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood wants the Constitution of the whole world to be the Quran. So no matter what Mursi does, no matter what happens, Egypt will become a Sharia state. Even if Mursi, let's say, doesn't become a dictator and it goes back to Egypt being ruled under a separation of powers, Sharia will still become the law of the land.
Well, was there any doubt in your mind, Ted, that when the people elected a Muslim Brotherhood president, that it would lead to Sharia?
There was no doubt in my mind, no. In fact, when the revolution first began, I knew exactly what was going to happen. It's just a matter of time. You see, look at the recent attacks that were done on the American embassy in Libya. Look at the photographs. Who are the people defacing the American flag? Do you see any elderly people? No. These are youths. These are college students. These are high school students. It is the youth in the Muslim world which will usher in Sharia government. Because when, for example, when my father was living in the West Bank in the 70s and in the 60s, majority of people didn't care about Islamic fundamentalism. The elderly people hated Islamic fundamentalism. When the youth got older, they became more idealistic. And in the 80s, that is when the West Bank, whether it be Ramallah or whether it be in Bethlehem and all of the supposed Palestinian territories, in the 80s, that is when Islam began to arise, because the youth got older, they became the predominant people, they became the new adults, so to say, and their ideas became more and more predominant in that region. So the same thing happened in Egypt. The elderly people, they wanted a person like Jamal Abdel Nasser. They wanted somebody like Mubarak, who wasn't going to enforce Sharia. There was certain elements of Sharia in Egypt under Mubarak, but nothing like what the Muslim Brotherhood wants. And so it's the youths in Egypt that want this. It's the cult. So in other words, there was a cultural shift, a major cultural shift in Egypt, and we're seeing the product of that today.
Let's talk about some of these new dictatorial powers that Morsi is claiming for himself. And you touched on one. Basically, he is wanting all his decisions to be immune from judicial review. Is that correct?
That's correct. But now, today it was reported that he's made a new compromise and said, I'll give the judges the power that they are supposed to be upholding, and I will simply be the sole protector over the Constitution. And like I said, that's not very much of a compromise, even if it does follow through, because whoever has control over the Constitution has control over the state of the nation in the future.
Yeah, because that Constitution will dictate what authority the judicial branch has.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So they're playing the game very smart. They're using semantics. In other words, it's all a game of words.
So when Morsi is saying that his decrees are necessary to, quote, protect the revolution and the nation's transition to democratic rule, I'm guessing you don't buy that, Ted.
Well, of course not. How is it democracy when you have one person that controls the will of everything? It's not democracy. And another thing also is we need to focus on the future state of Egypt. So we have all these protests, and everyone thinks, well, the protesters are the good guys because they don't want dictatorship. And we think that the protesters are saints, in other words. But that's still not true. See, this is the thing about the Middle East. What are they protesting about? They're not protesting about Sharia. They're protesting about whether or not they want to be ruled under a dictatorship. They don't want to be ruled under a dictatorship, but they still want Sharia. In fact, in the article that I wrote, there was a quote that I put up there by Hossam Ghariani, who is the president of the Supreme Judicial Council. So the Supreme Judicial Council, they don't want dictatorship, but they still want Sharia because the president of the judges, Hassan Ghariani, he said in a video just this year, before, a couple months before these protests commenced, he said that the majority of Egyptians want Sharia, that we need to implement it, and that, Allah willing, Egypt will become a Sharia state. He said this a number of months ago, and I have this, we translated this quote from the Arabic into the English. So we shouldn't, I think, we should be looking at the big picture. What is the big picture? The big picture is that Egypt will become a Sharia state.
How long before that happens, do you think?
I can't give you an exact date, but what I believe is that since there's so many people that are against Mursi's new idea, I think it'll escalate into a civil war. Because, see, here's the thing. People say, and I've heard the Egyptian people say this in quotes on the news and such. They say, well, just last year, we took out Mubarak, and now we're going to take out Mursi. We have that power. And they don't understand. No, they don't have that power. You see, once Islam takes over a country, look at Iran, look at Somalia, look at countries like in the Sudan right now, all these countries are Sharia states. Once Sharia takes over a nation, it's very, very difficult to revert back to a moderate government. The moderate government is a lot of times weaker than Islamic governments because they are influenced by these liberal ideas of democracy. So give the power to the people, let the people decide. So those governments tend to be less tyrannical. They tend to be weaker in regards to repelling a revolution. The Islamic governments aren't that way. Islamic government believes Allah has given me this power as the supreme ruler over this country, and I'm supposed to defend that divine right. And who are these people to question Allah? Who are these people to question God, in other words? And he becomes, in other words, a representation of the will of Allah, the Islamic deity. So they have a much more spiritual and idealistic idea to defend. And that belief is much stronger than secularism. Much stronger because we're talking about the human soul here. We're talking about idealism. So those governments tend to be much more strict and stronger against revolutions. Mubarak left voluntarily. The people didn't really push him out. If Mubarak wanted to, he could have annihilated all those protesters just as Saddam Hussein would have done when he was in power. But he didn't because he was a more liberally minded individual. Now with Mursi is not a liberally minded individual. He's not going to resign voluntarily as Mubarak did. He is going to use military force. With that said, the violence will escalate to the point where the opposition against Mursi will begin to use arms, and that will commence a civil war. In fact, there was an interview done today of the leader of al-Dustur party, Mohammed al-Baradei, and al-Baradei said specifically that the violence in Egypt will get so intense, and it will become so increased, and the tension will become so increased that a civil war will erupt.
Wow.
And that's exactly what's going to take place in the near future.
Ted Shoebat is our guest here today on Crosstalk as we speak about Egypt's coming tyranny, Egypt moving fast forward toward full-fledged Sharia. We're going to take a quick break and come back and look more about the implications of this. You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, president of the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, what did dinosaurs eat?
Chris, by studying the bones of dinosaurs, we're quite confident that most of them were plant eaters. Of course, in the beginning, God created all the animals to be vegetarian. But after the curse, things began to change. And soon, some of the animals began to acquire a taste for meat. By the time Noah's flood came along, which buried some of the carcasses and fossilized them, there's no question that some of them ate meat. It appears that they're all extinct now, so it's hard to know for sure how they lived and what their behavior patterns were. But we're certain most of them were totally vegetarian. Once again, Chris, scientific discoveries agree with what the Bible has to say. And it said so back in Genesis.
If you want to know more about the creation evolution issue, visit us on the web at www.icr.org. Back to Genesis is a production of the Institute for Creation Research. I'm Chris O'Brien. Thanks for tuning in.
You're listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America. We're talking about Egypt's coming tyranny today. Fox News reporting earlier today more than 100,000 protesters assembled in Cairo to protest the near absolute powers of Mohamed Mursi, and some very interesting developments. Our guest today, Ted Shoebat, his website, tedshoebat.com. You can check out some of his writings. One that I think you'll really find of interest: For God or for Tyranny, When Nations Deny God's Natural Law. Ted, in the middle of last week, the Obama administration was praising Egypt in their brokering this ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. And in one of your articles, you quote Secretary of State Clinton last Wednesday saying, quote, Egypt's new government is assuming the responsibility and leadership that has long made this country a cornerstone for regional stability and peace. Then we have the next day Mursi, who was claiming these new powers. Tell us your reaction to the White House's reaction. I mean, has the White House condemned these actions that are being taken place by the Egyptian leader?
Well, Hillary Clinton, I mean, for example, I read in the news today that the American government, Washington in general, is worried about the steps that Mursi is taking. But remember when the revolution was first happening and the elections were about to be concluded and the new revolutionary government was about to be established. Remember what Hillary Clinton said? She said that we're going to make sure that all the Egyptian politicians treat every Egyptian equally. Well, that's not what's happening right now. And the Coptic Christians are going to be the biggest victims. See, we're all focused on the protesters. But the protesters, at the end of the day, want Islam. Majority of them, I would say.
So what does this mean for Christians and non-Muslims?
That means there's going to be a Holocaust. And I know that sounds extreme. I know that sounds a little adventurous to state, but it's a guarantee, because you cannot have Christians living in freedom and have a Sharia state. In other words, to respond to what you said about the Hillary Clinton saying that praising Egypt, that because Egypt was the country where this supposed ceasefire was signed and everything. Compliance is impossible in the Islamic world. And this is a result of ignorance and people thinking that, well, Western values have influenced the Middle East to the point where now they can have a ceasefire. And we have Twitter and Facebook and cell phones and technology, and this is changing the world. You see, barbarism is now becoming extinct, and enlightened Western values and philosophy is becoming more and more influential in the Near East. Well, that's just a load of rubbish. Former Israeli diplomat Yoram Ettinger, this is what he had to say about Islamic peace treaties. He says the culture of compliance is foreign in the Middle East. This is somebody who lived in Israel. He was an Israeli diplomat. He knows the Middle East. And he says the culture of compliance is foreign in the Middle East, which has not experienced intra-Muslim compliance with intra-Muslim agreement for the last 1,400 years. It is a culture that reveres the 7th century and Muhammad's Treaty of Hudaybiyah, stipulating that treaties are not in perpetuity. Treaties may be violated in order to achieve the overriding goal of bringing enemies to submission upon amassing sufficient power to overcome the enemy. So this ceasefire, in my opinion, is nothing more than a trick of war. And this trick of war has been popular for thousands of years. I mean, look back at the war between Constantine and Licinius. Licinius was being defeated. He was losing the battle. He did a simple peace treaty simply to diverge his enemy, to distract his enemy so that he may rearm and re-strengthen his army. So this is an old trick that's been being played in the ancient world for thousands of years, and we're falling for it. That is the sad part. Now, what that will do is it will make the West give a undeserved trust to Mohamed Mursi. They think now that he is maybe a beacon for the West, an ally of the West, somebody that we can work with. This is what it's leading to. oath, this peace treaty, ceasefire, done in Egypt, this was Mursi's way of tricking the West into thinking that he is a moderate individual. Well, he is not. Now, to answer the other question about the Christian population, which is something that I am most focused on, the Christian population in Egypt is going to suffer, I think, the greatest, more than the protesters, more than anyone, because in Sharia law, for example, there is a rule, and this comes straight from the Quran, the surah of the tablecloth. It says anybody who goes against Allah, anybody who goes against Allah's beliefs, his teachings, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, must be punished. And these punishments are actually listed in the Quran. One of the punishments is severing the arm and the leg in opposite places, public execution, and another form of execution is something called salb. Salb is an Arabic word. It literally means crucifixion. So crucifixion is an execution that is demanded by Sharia to people who are against Islam. A number of months ago, there was a group of people who were against Mursi's government, who were crucified in front of the presidential palace. Let's not forget that. And many people were saying that that was a myth, that there was no crucifixions. But my father did a lot of research, looked into it, and we actually found the photographs of the victims who were crucified. And one of the victims had his entire rib cage severed right off from the crucifixion that he endured. So these types of punishments will be implemented in Egypt. And how do I know that? Because the last time we heard about crucifixion was what? In the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to be seeing this in the Islamic world. Because the Islamic world, as far as I'm concerned, is nothing but a continuation of ancient tyranny. Now, again, to finish my answer, look to a country like North Sudan. If we want to know what's going to happen in Egypt, we must look to North Sudan. North Sudan is very similar to Egypt. It is ruled by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Omar al-Bashir is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, just like Mursi is. It is ruled by a Sharia code, and it is it is dictated by what the Muslim Brotherhood believes in, meaning the Quran is the constitution, Sharia must be inflicted, Christians must be killed. What has happened to the Christian population in the Sudan, specifically in the Nuba Mountains? Millions of Christians have been killed. In fact, over 3 million people have been massacred by Omar al-Bashir's Muslim Brotherhood regime. It is a complete Holocaust and a genocide that is happening right now. And I interviewed with Ed Lyons. Ed Lyons is one of the experts on North Sudan. He's been to Sudan. He has seen how the Christians have been killed and massacred and the butchering and the atrocities that have occurred in the recent years. And he has told me that Omar al-Bashir is an Islamic fundamentalist. He is implementing Sharia, and he is one of the researchers who have tried to show to the world that the Holocaust, the current Holocaust, happening against the Christian population in the Sudan. Now, let's turn that and apply that to Egypt. Egypt was once a moderate country. It was an ally of the United States. It was an ally of Israel. It was under Mubarak. Well, now we have a shift, a complete, almost a 360-turn shift, where you have a Muslim Brotherhood now controlling the country.
So what's going to happen? Yeah, what does this do to the relationship between Israel and Egypt?
Well, Israel right now is very worried about Mursi, specifically because you have, for example, weapons coming in from Egypt into the West Bank. Israel is more worried right now about the Fajr 5 missiles that have the capabilities to reach the city of Tel Aviv and other major Israeli cities. And so Israel is worried that Egypt will not take the necessary turns it needs to take to prevent major weapons such as these from being shipped from its country into Gaza, where it can be fired into Israel. And like I said, a ceasefire is impossible. Look what Yoram Ettinger wrote. The culture of compliance is foreign to the Middle East. So Israel right now does not trust Mursi. They are not buying into the ceasefire. I guarantee you, they may say that in the media, but within themselves, they don't buy into it because they know the Middle East. And it's going to lead to more tension between Israel and Egypt.
We're talking today with Ted Shoebat. And Ted, while all of this is going on, things are also heating up in Syria. Do you believe we're going to see a change in leadership there, too?
I believe it's more likely that we're going to see a regime change soon. See, here's the thing. I believe that Assad will eventually be taken down. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm almost 100% sure. Mm-hmm. Because when you have all of the allies and Turkey against Syria, when you have America, France, England allying or joining up with Turkey, and Turkey joining up with NATO, and you have all of these countries, and you have NATO working together as one to oust out Bashar al-Assad, that tells me that Bashar al-Assad is going to go. Now, if the Western powers and if NATO and if Turkey never got involved, Assad will be fine. Assad will be still in power, and he'll be in power for a very long time because his military is strong enough to repulse the rebellion in his country. But now that you have NATO and Turkey and America and England and France, it's the odds are against Bashar al-Assad. And the reason why I believe that is because just look at what happened to Gaddafi. You had Gaddafi, who was defeating the rebellion. He was crushing the revolution. He was the victor for a while against the rebels. But once NATO got involved, that is when Gaddafi saw his downfall. It wasn't the Libyan people that ousted out Gaddafi. Mm-hmm. It was NATO that ousted out Gaddafi. So when you see Western forces planning on intervening in Syria, that is a foreshadower of Bashar al-Assad's downfall.
So what do you see as being the end goal for this region?
Syria, the revolution in Syria, that's a very good question. The revolution in Syria is an Islamic movement. It's nothing more. It is much worse and much more brutal and violent than the revolution in Egypt. And the reason why is because there was really no need for a war to oust out Mubarak. Most Egyptians wanted him gone. And so there wasn't a need to have a civil war over ousting out Mubarak. Syria is a different story. The majority of Syrians want Bashar al-Assad. And most people are shocked when I tell them that, but it's true. The majority of Syrians don't want Bashar al-Assad gone. In fact, if you had an election between an Islamic fundamentalist and Bashar al-Assad, I guarantee you Assad would win. Every Christian from Syria that I have heard from or maybe have talked to, every single one of them want Assad to stay in power because Assad is protecting the Christian population. The majority of the people that are fighting in Syria against the Assad regime are not Syrians. They are foreign fighters from Saudi Arabia, from Pakistan, from Qatar, from Jordan, from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey, from Chechnya, from Bangladesh, from Afghanistan. You have all of these foreign fighters traveling to do a jihad against the regime. People say, well, Ted, Assad is an evil person. Well, I'm sure he's an evil person. He's a dictator. But at the same time, Assad is nowhere near as evil as the rebels. Assad, in fact, is protecting the very small Christian population and the even smaller Jewish population in Syria. There are only 200 Jews living in Syria. And Assad has taken the means to have those people protected. In fact, they're building a new mosque in not a mosque, they're building a new synagogue in Damascus right now.
Wow.
So if the Assad regime goes, Syria will become Islamist.
Let's quick take a break, and also let's open the phone lines where you can talk with Ted Shoebat today on Crosstalk. Our number 800-733-9829. If you have a question, a comment for our guest today, 800-733-9829. This is Crosstalk. We'll be right back.
Often, when it's time to pay the bills, we murmur at having to lay out money for a number of expenses. In other cases, spending becomes impulsive to buy now, rather than evaluate if the expense is necessary. It's often a time when the focus is on the temporal rather than the eternal. VCY America has a way for you to direct your thoughts heavenward. We are offering a two-toned, brown, heavy vinyl checkbook cover with a scripture verse from Philippians 4:13 embossed in silver type. I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. It's a constant reminder that we all belong to Christ and that He is the one who enables us. It's also a reminder that our stewardship is to honor Him. VCY is making available this checkbook cover with the scripture text for a donation of $7. Just call 1-800-729-9829. That's 1-800-729-9829. Or write VCY at 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208.
Ted Shoebat with us today, son of Walid Shoebat, a former P.L.O. terrorist. Ted is very dedicated in his research and analysis of the issues going on in the Middle East and around the world. Author of For God or For Tyranny. You can get more information, tedshoebat.com. That's TEDSHOEBAT.com, tedshoebat.com. And just before we go to phone calls, by the way, our number here, 800-733-9829. Ted, just take a moment, if you would, to explain further about the implications upon all of this here, the uprising, the imposition of Sharia in Egypt and Syria as it relates to the Coptic and the Christian populations in these nations.
Well, of course, like I said, I believe if the Western allies and NATO really commits to what they're saying and they want to oust Assad, the Christian population and the Jewish population in Syria will become so vulnerable because 80,000 Christians, let's not forget, in this year alone in Homs, in the region of Homs in Syria, you had 80,000 Christians who were exiled out of their homes by the Free Syrian Army. Now, what's very sad is that McCain and the U.S. government right now they are saying that we should work with the Free Syrian Army. In fact, Obama has allowed for millions of dollars to go and to help and support the Free Syrian Army. And this is a terrorist organization. This is a terrorist organization connected with Al Qaeda. In Egypt also, once I believe Mursi perhaps officiates his power, or when Sharia is ultimately and this is inevitably imposed, the Christian population will be hugely susceptible for having atrocities inflicted upon them. Let's not forget when Nero, to bring up history here, before Nero implemented a full persecution on the church in the Roman Empire, what did he do? He first had to take control of the whole Roman government. He first had to impose his will over the dictates of the Roman state. Then that's when the persecution was implemented. So I believe what Mursi is doing now is he wants to first officiate his power over the judiciary branch, the judicial branch of the Egyptian government. And once that happens, then we will see a mass persecution take place in the church. And the church, I'm afraid, has become quite silent on this issue. Very few Christians in America are bringing this up. But the church needs to become, I think, much more outspoken and vocal on this issue and to actually preach to their congregations on the persecutions that will be happening and the persecutions that are happening now in Sudan, which is already under a Muslim Brotherhood government.
Let's get to the phone lines here. Fred, you're our first caller. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Yes, thank you. In your studies and research through your family about Egypt, was there ever a time when Egypt extended past Kenya or all the way to southern Africa? Is there anything on maps or research of histories of the countries where it did?
That's good. Well, the only historical era of Egypt that I have read in which they passed into, let's say, Nubia or into the Kushite region of Africa was in when it was being ruled under the pharaohs. The ancient Egyptian empire expanded all the way to the Sudan. But other than that, it's not to my knowledge that Egypt has ever extended itself into Kenya. Are you saying the government of Egypt controlled Kenya? Is that what you're asking?
The country, whether government or the country itself, if it belonged to Egypt as a province or something like that even.
I don't think so. If it did happen, it's not to my knowledge. The only time I've ever read about anything like that when it was being ruled under the pharaohs.
Thank you for the call here, Fred. To Harry in Michigan, you're on the air.
Yeah, Jim, thank you very much for this today. Ted, my question for you is, since the people of Egypt voted in Sharia, obviously they want it. Shouldn't we then get out of Egypt and take our foreign aid and just get out of there? I would think that's what we should be doing.
Well, absolutely. We should not ever be supporting a Muslim Brotherhood government. Like I said, Osama bin Laden is a product of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Osama bin Laden helped orchestrate 9/11, which killed around 3,000 American lives. So we should not be ever funding the Egyptian government. But sadly, Obama has done that. Let's not forget, over $1 billion, I believe last year, Obama sent to the new revolutionary government of Egypt. Now, what I do believe America should do, and for any civilized nation, is to see to it that the Copts are given the liberty to escape out of those countries, because they don't have the means to do so. Many of them are poor. The rich ones do, but not the average Coptic Christian does not. So I believe that the American country, the American government, needs to prevent another Holocaust from taking place. We always hear never again in regards to the Jewish Holocaust in Germany, but the fact of the matter is never again is happening again, and it's going to happen again pretty soon.
Thank you, Harry, for the call.
Thank you, Jim.
To Carolyn in Utica, New York. You're on the air.
Oh, hi. I was just wondering, well, since there's so much... I just lost my train of thought. Actually, I was just wondering, why would we be funding or even joining with NATO and even Europe to help these people to become more stable and to take over when they're going against the very values that we as our European nations go against? It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. It's an enigma to many of us, and sometimes it's an enigma to me. The NATO, if you look on YouTube, there's many videos that the Libyan people who did not want to see the ousting of Gaddafi take place have placed on YouTube and on all over the internet of the atrocities which NATO has committed. In fact, my father wrote a whole article exposing the evils of not only the Libyan rebels but NATO themselves. NATO helped implement rape departments, rape stations where women were being raped systematically. They took women and cut their breasts out, mutilated them, and wrote with their blood graffiti on the wall. There was mass atrocities and people getting killed with machetes. 300,000 Libyans were massacred by NATO and the rebels. NATO, as far as I'm concerned, is a fascistic organization. It's a tyrannical organization. And it's very sad to see that America is still willing to work with them. And I think that America is really being used as the dummy here. France and England are the ones pushing America to oust out Assad. It's not America. It's not the other way around. It's David Cameron, and it is François Hollande, the new prime minister in France, the leader of France, they are the ones who are pushing the U.S. And the U.S. is happily getting involved.
Thank you, Carolyn. And at the same time, we've got Sharia becoming just on a fast-paced mode for England as well.
Absolutely, yes. Go on.
And the push is taking place there, and you're mentioning these nations. I mean, when we have the leadership change that took place in France and Cameron here in England, one asks the question: how long before we're seeing the implementation of Sharia here in the United States as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. Even before, let's say, even before David Cameron became prime minister in England, there was a very popular blog that came out in England. I remember it was called Lionheart, and it was a conservative blog that was exposing the evils of Islam and Sharia. And the English government, British government, sent out a warrant for his arrest, supposedly for inciting hate speech. And the author of the blog was out driving, trying to escape the police. Now, they eventually nullified the warrant. And the only reason why they did that was because the many different media outlets were talking about it. So the fact that they sent out a warrant for a man's arrest simply for writing, not even a website, it's a blog, is very scary to me. And I remember when the embassies were being attacked, for example, in Sudan and in Egypt and in Indonesia, the German embassy and the British embassy and the U.S. embassy, they were attacked in Sudan. The U.S. embassy was attacked in Egypt. When all these riots were happening, there were people, professors, who called themselves internationalists, coming out and saying, well, we need to replace the national courts of the United States with international courts. In other words, make international law the new jurisprudence of the United States. Forget about the First Amendment. Forget about the Constitution. Let's replace it with a universal court. It's very scary if these people get their way. And I remember when Geert Wilders from Holland, the Dutch politician, when he's still exposing Islam, but he actually had a warrant for his arrest, and he was in fact subpoenaed to appear before an international court. Now they didn't. Eventually, they nullified it. They neutralized the subpoena. But like I said, and similarly to what happened in England, if there are subpoenas and warrants out to try people for simply talking bad about Islam in free societies and in civilized countries like Holland or England, I'm very worried that the same thing will be beginning to take place in America.
Yeah.
And you're going to see people maybe punished by the U.S. government for talking bad about Islam.
And folks, don't be fooled. There are those who are calling for Sharia courts here in the United States. And keep in mind that we have folk like Justice Ginsburg citing international law as the basis for rulings that are made. Let's go to John next in West Milwaukee. You're on the air, John.
Yes. How does Farrakhan and Nation of Islam fit in all this?
That's a good question. The Nation of Islam... The Nation of Islam is really being used, I believe, by the fundamentalists. The members of the Nation of Islam, in my opinion, are not really fundamentalists. They are, in fact, their own cult. They're like a splinter group of Islam because they mixed Islam with black supremacy. And they believe that, many of them actually believe that Muhammad was, in fact, a black man. He was an African, not an Arab. So it really goes against what any traditional Muslim would believe in. So they're a splinter group, but they're still being used. What I'm worried about in regards to the Nation of Islam is that because many of the members of the Nation of Islam were once convicts. See, most people don't know this, but the majority of the Muslim population in America are not Middle Eastern. They're blacks. And the reason why is because you have a lot of Islamic missionary work happening right now in the prison system, and they're using these blacks to join Islam. And many of these African Americans become members of the Nation of Islam. They become members of the black Muslim movement. And I'm afraid that the Muslims will use these people because they already have criminal behavior. They already have a hatred toward the establishment in America, the conservative establishment in America, that they will use them to implement violence against people who talk bad about Islam.
Wow.
That's what I'm worried about. And I see that coming into the horizon quite possibly.
Let's go next to Mike. You're on the air, Mike, in Wisconsin. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I always see the rockets being used from Hezbollah. They're firing, and now they're hitting Tel Aviv, and they're getting closer to Jerusalem. What do you think your guests would think about if one of those stray rockets hit the Dome of the Rock, and how the Muslims would react to that?
Well, that's a good question. When Gaza was firing, when Hamas was firing these rockets, some of these rockets were close to actually hitting Jerusalem, and they were Muslims actually protesting against Hamas. Why are they firing rockets hitting Jerusalem? The fact is that the Hamas they don't really care about holy sites. In fact, they would rather see Jews dead. In fact, in Islam, jihad is more important than following the 5 pillars of Islam.
Interesting. We're going to take a quick break and come back with a few more thoughts on that. Thanks for the question here. Mike, you're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Our guest today, Ted Shoebat.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewweekend.com. Can I speak to you today if you're someone that is dealing with anxiety, depression, fear, or worry? The Bible makes it very clear that we're not to be anxious. In fact, we're to be anxious for nothing, but in prayer and supplication make our requests known to the Lord. We're also told in 1 Peter that we're to cast our cares on him, for he careth for us. Did you know that Proverbs chapter 12, verse 25 says that anxiety causes depression? A lot of people today struggle with depression, and one reason why is because they are anxious. They have anxiety, they worry, they have fear. But the Bible speaks to this issue. Now, I know it's easily done, but it can also be easily corrected as we get into God's Word and we understand God's power, God's provision, the priority that we are to God, and God's providence. In our next commentary, we'll talk about those things. But let me encourage you to get into the Word and to study God's Word and commit it to memory, because God desires that we not be anxious and thus have depression.
Now we're talking about Egypt's coming tyranny today with Ted Shoebat, and he is authored For God or For Tyranny. You can check out more on his website, tedshoebat.com. We take a look here at these, and the last caller brought it in, rockets, being aimed toward Jerusalem here. One of the criticisms that we've seen in the media here, Ted, relates to Israel destroying holy sites. I mean, we're talking about the Dome on the Rock perhaps being hit, but they're talking about Israel bombing holy sites. What are we led to believe with this?
Right. Well, it's a good question. Hamas has been using mosques to fire rockets from them. We actually have video footage that we found from the Middle East, and we posted this. I posted it on my father's website, Shoebat.com. That the Hamas they were firing rockets literally from mosques, and we have video footage, aerial footage of these rocket launchers right in front of a mosque, smack right in front of a mosque. And they are firing these propelled rockets right into Israel from the mosque. So Israel has no choice but to fire back and hit these launchers, where a mosque will be inevitably damaged or even destroyed. And let's look at the difference between Israel and Hamas. Israel has far less civilian casualties. Why? Because the Israeli government takes the measures to protect their people, to see to it that their civilians are protected, their population is protected. Now, that is opposed to what Hamas does. Hamas will use their civilians as human shields. In fact, we had one of the mouthpieces for Hamas boast proudly that Hamas uses the elderly and women and children as human shields. And the reason why they do this is because, for one, they have no respect for human life, as opposed to Israel. The Jews still have, they're still rooted in the Torah, which is a part of the Bible. So that explains the respect for human life. And also, Hamas is using the deaths of their people, their civilians, as a way to get the media behind them, to support them, and to be against Israel. So it is a publicity stunt, in other words, by Hamas.
Let's go to our next caller from Boston. And Mason, thank you for calling. You're on the air.
A couple of questions. I want to continue with the rockets. Why does Israel not go into the Strip and take it over? The number of times that they've sent rockets across year after year after year. And then the other part of the question is, what about, this nuclear energy that they're doing over there? Why does Israel listen to America and just not take it out? Because they could just use a dirty bomb, not even a nuclear bomb, and cause catastrophic problems. Right.
That's a good question. I think Israel eventually will do that. It may take a little while and more, and it's very sad. It's a part of it, I think, is corruption. The Israeli government are terrified of getting bad press and bad publicity from the world. They are afraid of the opinions of the world. So, it's quite a major role that plays in this is government corruption, government wanting to preserve their image. And another reason, I think, is because you have the United States pressuring Israel, don't kill a lot of civilians, don't make yourself look bad, don't make yourselves look like you're a bunch of tyrants who want to kill innocent civilians. And Israel doesn't want to kill civilians. Israel simply wants to protect itself. But eventually it will. Let's look at the Scriptures. The Scripture prophesizes that all of East Jerusalem will be conquered by the enemies of Israel. And the Bible gives us those countries, Cush, which is Somalia, and if you look at Iraq, Babylon, Persia, Iran, all these countries are Muslim today. So Bible prophecy tells us that Israel, part of Israel, will be taken and invaded by the Muslims. And many, many Israelis will die. The Bible, in fact, tells us that the men will be killed and the women will be ravished. The women will be raped. And that is when Israel will take the lead and will ignore the pressures from the outside world and will take a stand and will eventually obliterate Hamas and take over that region of the West Bank. So I agree with the caller. It's quite an enigma to me why they don't do it now. But a lot of it has to do with corruption. But eventually Israel will do that. Eventually Israel will destroy its enemies.
Let's pick up one final call. This is Ed from New Berlin. You're on the air. Go ahead, Ed.
Hi. I have a question about possible NATO involvement in Syria using the same pretext as Obama did when he used NATO in Libya.
Mm-hmm.
And what is your question, Ed?
What signs do you see, if any, that Obama will involve NATO in Syria against Assad using the same pretext he did in Libya?
Great, thanks.
Well, that's a good question. They're already using the same pretexts. They're saying that Assad is a tyrant and he needs to be taken out, just like exactly what they applied on Gaddafi. Within hours after Obama got reelected, you already had England and France and NATO getting together and talking about how they're going to try to get Obama on the bandwagon against Assad. And then a number of weeks ago on a Thursday, you had ambassadors from America, from Turkey, from England, France, and people from NATO get together and meet with actual Syrian rebels in Doha, Qatar, south of Arabia. So America and NATO are already getting involved. They're already working together. They're already discussing how they're going to take out Assad. Turkey is already asking from NATO to acquire Patriot missiles so that they can actually build a base for the rebels in Syria, place the missiles around the base to actually repel any attacks from the Syrian government. So they're already discussing it, and they're already using the same pretexts that they used before taking out Gaddafi.
Egypt's coming tyranny. One other side question here very quickly, Ted. Do you have any concerns about Susan Rice becoming the next Secretary of State?
You know, my opinion for these American politicians is the same. I mean, they're all going to be puppets and mouthpieces for the Obama administration. I think Susan Rice is nothing special, in my opinion, and I'm not really. She's not a big concern for me. I mean, from her, I'm expecting the same thing we got from Condoleezza Rice, if not worse. So.
Ted, again, give us your website for those who like to get more information about your books and writings and your blog as well.
Definitely. They can go to tedshoebat.com. That's TEDSHOEBAT, Shoe and Bat put together, tedshoebat.com. And the name of my book is called For God or For Tyranny, and we co-authored that. Me and my father did. It's called For God or For Tyranny.
When nations
deny... It's a very good book.
Yeah, God's natural law. Well, thank you, Ted. God bless you, and thank you for joining us here today on the broadcast.
God bless you, sir. Thanks for having me on.
Mm-hmm. And ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us today here on Crosstalk. All the more reminder that we need to be praying and keeping this world in prayer before our God.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.